All right, welcome to Math 119-312, the mathematics of pandemics. Today is going to be our second student-run presentation on COVID-19 and the media. Before we start with that, just a couple of announcements. All the groups should be getting back to me as to how things are going and when you'll be ready to present. I have gotten some positive feedback from students in the class about spending Friday talking about the mathematics behind the last problems. So I will do the first part of the class on the 119 part, and then the second half on the 312. Even if you're only in 119, it's still potentially interesting to stay and listen to what kind of math shows up as you go a little bit further. There's some really nice ideas. For some of the problems, it all comes down to, can you find the right way to look at things to make it simplify nicely? All right, so without further ado, I am going to turn this over to the COVID-19 and the media group. Take it away.
There she is.
Are you able to hear the class?
Oh, that looks good, actually. What is that?
This actually looks like a restaurant. It's oatmeal with peanut butter, cinnamon, and apple.
We can't hear you. Are you saying something? Hello?
Hi. Are we starting the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay.
Can people in the
Perfect.
class hear this or no? Okay. All right, so take it away.
Okay, so hi, thank you, Professor Miller. The topic of COVID in the media turned out to be a really interesting subject because it was easy to see how bias can infiltrate media coverage, both in reporting and in how the facts can be manipulated to lean one way or the other. So we wanted to start off with the example of two different media outlets analyzing the same source. The source in these cases is President Trump's tweet on October 5th, which said, quotes, "I will be leaving the great Walter Reed Medical Center today at 6:30 p.m. Feeling really good. Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago." End quote. For our two sources, we are using Fox News, which is a more conservative media outlet, and AZ Central, which according to allsides.com is perceived to be a relatively politically unbiased news source. We, the audience, can clearly see just in the titles the information that these media outlets are going to be giving to the public. So Fox News reports that Alex Bernstein, author of Unreported Truth, said, quote, "We have gone crazy and Donald Trump walked out of the hospital today and said what needed to be said," unquote. Fox News is reporting a fact. Bernstein did say this. AZ Central's article says, quote, "Trump's 'Don't be afraid of COVID' tweet may be the most irresponsible one in history," end quote. This is also a fact. It may be irresponsible. Of course, it may not be as well. The wording makes it hard to say the quotation is misinformation. Two media outlets report on the same situation, and a person reading both would come away with an entirely different take on the COVID-19 situation. As consumers of information, we need to read carefully how information is given to us, the language used, the veracity of the person giving us the information, etc. So this brings us to our first set of questions. How does the public decide what is fact? Does anyone's opinion get swayed? And do news sources change anyone's minds, or are they only reading what validates already formed opinion?
The next, more questions to consider from the media. I mean, when evaluating media, how they reflect data given for COVID-19. What information is this figure, article, and data given us, and what information is the source leaving out, and why? Are there any narratives trying to be pushed? What story are they trying to tell? In evaluating media, how can we work to separate intent versus the impact of a source? And what tools can we use to evaluate media sources and how they're giving information? More motives for media that may be pushed. through the information given? Are there economic motives? Separationist media makes money or for ad space, are the political motives and political bias for the upcoming election and partisanship, and how media is displayed surrounding, how media displays results and data surrounding COVID. Also, are there other motives surrounding viewership and ratings and how information is presented to catch the eye of an audience? Some tools that we use to evaluate sources, attention to tone and what words are being used and why, what is being left out and why do we think it's being left out, what information is being provided and how is it being presented, what visuals are used to accompany the story, who has access to different types and forms of information, and what facts would you like to see and why has it already been presented in the first place?
So to start off talking about actual media sources, we're going to be talking about two television news sources, which are two pretty biased media networks from two sides of the spectrum, so CNN and Fox News. So before we started talking about any individual topics, we thought we'd show this graph talking about the amount of time invested on COVID-19 coverage, CNN versus Fox News. And what this can show is the amount of media coverage a news source gives to COVID-19 could change viewers' perception of the severity of the virus and what that means for America.
Okay, so we're now going to watch two little news clips, one of CNN's coverage of the virus and one of Fox's coverage of the virus, both looking at when Trump was released from the hospital after getting COVID. So we're going to stop for the person screen sharing, we're going to stop at 1:18 for this Fox.
It is preservative.
You don't need to be a Trump partisan to feel good about the recovery. You just need to be a decent person. The moment you find yourself rooting for another man's illness or death is the moment you need to stop immediately in your tracks, pause, and take stock of your soul. You're the one who's sick and badly in need of help. You're rotting from within. But the media are not stopping. They're not even pausing. They're too angry. Donald Trump is alive. They were hoping that wouldn't happen. Worse, Trump walked out of the hospital under his own steam after just 3 days. 74 years old, and the virus didn't really slow him down. In fact, he looks fine. These are dangerous facts. If you're allowed to think about them too much, you might draw the wrong conclusions. You might conclude the coronavirus isn't quite as scary as they're telling you it is. You might regret giving up your constitutional rights in a panic last spring, or letting them destroy the American economy in response. You might find yourself enraged that they're keeping your kids from getting an education and have for 6 months. And above all, you might stop believing the news media. Why are we watching this crap? It's not news, it's propaganda. They're lying to us. We just caught them again. All weekend.
Just one quick comment. There's a comment in the chat, but my iPad is not letting me see what that is.
It says, please answer your questions regarding those first actual item. That's the question. So I think that's basically the questions that we posed on slide 7, attention to tone, and we should answer those questions. I think after we review these news sources, we can probably answer those questions with better detail.
President Donald Trump has been in coronavirus, but that has not stopped him from making false claims about the coronavirus. Since Trump got out of the hospital, he has made a flurry of inaccurate statements, both about the virus itself and about the state of the pandemic. Listen to what he said on Fox Business about what happens to people who get the coronavirus.
You catch this thing. A lot of people caught it. And remember this, when you catch it, you get better.
It is obviously not true that everyone who gets the virus simply gets better. At the time the president said this, more than 211,000 Americans had died from the virus. And of course, many others had suffered significant health damage. Trump was also inaccurate again about the vaccine situation. Here's what he said in a pre-recorded social media video.
We have the best medicines in the world, and it all happened very shortly, and they're all getting approved, and the vaccines are coming momentarily.
Now, we all know this president uses hyperbole, but momentarily is at least highly misleading. Now, it is very possible that there will be at least one vaccine approved at some point this year. But what the president always leaves out is that even if that happens, all the experts have been clear, it is exceedingly unlikely this vaccine will be distributed to most Americans before next year.
If you're talking about getting back to a degree of normality which resembles where we were prior to COVID, it's going to be well into 2021, maybe even towards the end of 2021.
Trump was also, as usual, dishonest about the pandemic on Twitter. In one tweet, he reverted back to his false rhetoric from 7 months ago about how COVID-19 is supposedly less bad than the flu. According to CDC estimates, the US hasn't hit 100,000 deaths in a flu season since all the way back in 1968. To put it another way, we've had more deaths this year from the coronavirus than flu deaths from the last 5 flu seasons combined. Now, there is one population, that's healthy children, that the CDC says is indeed less severely affected by COVID-19 than it is by the flu. But clearly, the coronavirus is killing way more people on the whole. And we know that Trump admitted on tape with Bob Woodward that the coronavirus is much deadlier.
You just breathe the air, that's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus.
Now, Trump also tweeted out a video of a pandemic-related incident in Idaho, and he captioned it by saying, "Dems want to shut your churches down permanently." That's dishonest in a couple big ways. First of all, no Democrat of any consequence is proposing to shut down churches permanently. Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential nominee, is a regular churchgoer himself. Second, this incident itself is not what the president suggested. So what happened? A church organized a psalm-singing protest in a city hall parking lot, not at a church, to oppose a local order requiring people to do social distancing in public and to wear masks in public. 5 people received citations for allegedly not wearing masks or violating social distancing requirements. 3 people were arrested for allegedly obstructing or resisting officers. That's it. The end. No one proposed shutting down churches. And the mayor of the city in Idaho, called Moscow, he was a registered Republican.
Can you pause your presentation for 1 second? I'm going to try to change how the audio is projected in the classroom. Okay, continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so as we said, Fox News is a very conservative, right-leaning news source, and its partisan leaning is very clear through the video clip that we watched. So the reporter uses a lot of second person, and when he's talking this way, he's really referring to liberal-minded people who dislike Trump and may have expressed excitement over him contracting COVID when he says things like, if you wanted Trump to die from COVID, you're the one who's sick. So through this second person you, he's literally creating this you versus us mentality and like separating people into these 2 different ideological groups. So the liberals versus the conservatives, or the Republicans versus the Democrats. So it's very partisan the way that he's reporting this story. And by doing this, he creates this sense of sort of camaraderie among his viewers that's very much otherizes people with different political views and people who believe that we have been like acting responsibly when we've been shutting down some parts of the nation in response to COVID. And he uses very inflammatory word choices, such as saying like the media is, you should be enraged how the liberal media is reporting these issues. They've been lying to us. It's been propaganda. And talks negatively about the media, which he interprets as basically these other liberal news sources. And we can see the possible economic motives that he might have in doing this. If he's able to make people who are watching perceive Fox News as basically the only news source that's actually telling the truth and giving legitimate news, then that means that they're not going to turn to other news sources for information, which could increase Fox's economic profit. So that could be a possible motivation for why he's portraying the information this way. We can see also that he condemns these liberal approaches to the pandemic, saying that they've been destroying the economy, they've been preventing kids from going to school, people are being forced to give up their constitutional rights. And through talking basically about all that's been lost and not about the possible positive outcomes that may have resulted from these choices, such as mitigating the effects of COVID-19, you get this really one-sided narrative to the story. And then they also, through this create this very pro-Trump narrative and show him as resilient and strong in response to how quickly he overcame COVID, which makes total sense with their political leaning, especially since we're so close to the upcoming presidential election. Portraying Trump positively would benefit them because they have incentive in him getting reelected due to their partisanship. So they say that Trump was continuing to work while sick, saying COVID couldn't stop him, emphasized how shortly he had COVID really impacting him, saying that he was released from the hospital after only 3 days. And then also something that I took from this was they showed the video clip of Trump walking out of the White House, and the reporter states, Trump looks fine, he's doing good, which is a bit ridiculous of a statement because the video clip is just a few seconds long. And you really can't tell just from looking at someone, their physical state, and whether they've recovered from COVID or not. So this evidence is not sufficient to support his claim.
So now we are going to be looking at news source on the other side of the political spectrum, CNN, which is a liberal democratic news source. So the biggest observation that we had is that this reporter uses vocal inflection and word choice to create this anti-Trump narrative. So to start off, the reporter calls himself a fact-check reporter. This is not unique to CNN, but when every media uses this phrase, it makes this appearance of objectivity when whatever facts they may be checking may not be true. And then on Fox Business, Trump said, when you catch it, you get better. So in response to this, the reporter said, this is obviously not true, using sort of this emotional inflection, as well as using the words of obvious makes Trump appear uneducated and Trump supporters uneducated. And then again, he uses this same sort of inflection when he says Trump was inaccurate again, conveys the message that Trump is frequently incorrect and that we are, we're all in this together in our annoyance with Trump consistently being wrong. And this is the same idea when we use the quote, we all know this president. So we making this us versus them rhetoric. So the first person, we creates us versus them mindset, and then calls Trump this president rather than our president, the president, or calling him President Trump.
So in addition to these news sources that we've been looking at, we also have to take into account that in today's environment, social media becomes a significant source of news. And on social media, there are even less standards of professionalism. And this is where we see when we heard a lot about Russian propaganda and those sorts of things. Social media is what allows claims like that to spread without necessarily having to be substantiated. And that's because when you're friends with like-minded people, you might potentially be less inclined to sort of fact check whatever is being said. And so we've seen recently with Twitter introducing the fact checking tool, that social media companies are beginning to question what responsibility they might have to fact check and prevent falsehoods from spreading on their sites. I know even if we're looking at Gen Z media, TikTok has a little fact check thing that pops up if any TikTok is perceived to be about COVID. So there definitely becomes the question of like, is social media for the free exchange of ideas, or do they have a responsibility to fact check? In addition, algorithms have become essential to the way that social media websites function. And algorithms have been shown to create echo chambers and polarization. Actually, the Wall Street Journal did a report earlier this year that found that Facebook had launched an internal investigation into whether or not its algorithms produced more polarization. And they found that Facebook internally found that its algorithms were incredibly polarizing. But at the same time, Facebook then decided to do nothing about it for a variety of reasons that Wall Street Journal report goes into. And algorithms function at their base level on Facebook. They function by like showing you articles that your friends have interacted with. So this is where we get this idea of blue feed, red feed. And this is a tool that, once again, the Wall Street Journal ran from 2016 to 2019. So it doesn't go into COVID. But if you wanted to check out this blue feed, red feed tool and see sort of the archived post, you get the idea of how like the same day's stories can be shown completely differently on a Facebook feed. So you just get the idea that via the algorithm and via taking a look at what your friends are interacting with, people in effect are working off of a completely different set of facts, or what they hold to be true might be completely different just based on which type of Facebook feed you're scrolling through and what echo chamber your particular algorithm has created.
Excuse me, can I interject something before you rush forward? You can give the Kierkegaard quote and then I have a question.
Of course.
You want me to ask the question first?
Yeah.
You guys raced over those video clips. My question is, did either of the two speakers offer a point that conceded information to the other side?
I think one example that comes to mind, I'm not totally sure where we're headed with this, but I do remember that in the CNN clip, we heard when they were talking about the effects of COVID on young kids, I think we heard the CNN fact checker say that like, we've now come to understand that the effects might be less severe than the flu on young children, which seemed to be sort of a concession.
That's one point. The second one is he did give statistics on deaths from the flu. They're not insignificant. So he tried two different ways to give some perspective on what he was saying. My problem here is that you are equating two very different news outlets. You're giving them an equal standing. It's a he said, she said, when it's not. And that's one of the great tests, is do you give information that would undercut a simplistic one-side view? And the CNN speaker gave two of those: number of flu deaths and the fact that children, in fact, were often more affected by the flu than by COVID.
So should we give more weight to that news source, like because they put those 2 points up? Or I guess his reporting?
Well, the only thing, what I will say, one is an entertainment commentator. The other one is putting himself forth as a reporter, but yes, he acted in that regard. I mean, if you're a responsible media outlet, you will not make categorical statements. You will make statements such as, yes, the flu is very significant. Here are deaths from flu, and here is what the comparison is. So yes, totally non-equatable, those two sources.
Thank you.
And then the second question becomes, when we say we all know, we'd have to get into the political question of whether, in fact, there is a track record of unprecedented dishonesty currently. Is that a partisan statement or is it an accurate statement? Or both?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think, and if I'm correct, the Kierkegaard quote was something that you had sent along for inclusion potentially that you felt was particularly relevant to these questions.
I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give it a read and maybe that might spark some further discussion. There is an unrest within you above which, nevertheless, consciousness soars clearly and lucidly. Your whole soul is concentrated upon this sole point. Your understanding devises 100 plans for the attack. It fails in one direction. Instantly, your almost diabolical dialectic is capable of explaining the previous failure in such a way that it must be serviceable for the new line of operations. You are constantly hovering over yourself, and however decisive every step may be, you retain the possibility of interpretation in which one word is able to alter everything. Yeah, so when we're thinking about in what ways this quote applies to the media or political communications during the pandemic, yeah, Paul, I don't know if you have anything to potentially speak to this, but I think, like, I guess for me, taking apart this quote, I think we can see with the idea of the dialectic, how we're looking at sort of the idea of, like, when new information comes that questions your worldview, how do you respond to it?
Well, here would be the specific example. You had one faction of the media that early on echoed time and again a talking point. The talking point was, this is no worse than the flu. Obviously, the most popular radio talk show host in America said it's just the common cold. You're all aware of that. Then at a certain point, there was a 180-degree shift to saying, we've said all along, we never said it was just nothing, it's deadly, yes, it's a problem. It was one day, one approach, one day the other. Each point of view said decisively. As you've discovered in the class, we're constantly learning new things about the COVID. You may make a categorical statement early on that the biggest danger is touching objects, and then you learn transmission through the air. So it is more dangerous. If you're responsible, you are saying that you got it wrong at first. You're not being absolute. Kierkegaard's quote is from either or, and it's about people that will take opposite points of view, but with equal talk from the mount confidence. And that's what a lot of pundits do, because if you're authoritative, you sound authoritative to your audience.
May I interject? I think we should hold questions and discussion till the end so everyone can get through the presentation, just so students can focus and such, and then we can open up at the end. We have some discussion topics that close our presentation, so if everyone is okay with that, I think it would help with the focus of connecting remote students with in-person in class.
All right, so we had the pleasure of interviewing Emily Bright. She's a media practitioner. She works for Minnesota Public Radio, and she's responsible for writing the news story and also narrating them. So she has a very unique perspective when it comes to the pandemic and reporting the information on different sources. So voice is very interesting because she's actually narrating a story with the numbers. So for example, she gets the data from like Johns Hopkins Medical to like the test tracking, so the number of cases, the number of infected patients, number of deaths every day at 11, and then she has to have a story ready by 12 p.m. So she told us that part, having you know, having the data coming in every day at a certain time and having to have a story and ready in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then like to disseminate it in an hour was very challenging. And sometimes she would get these large spikes of cases, and she had to write a story where she would inform the population but not worry them about what's happening. So this availability of instantaneous information is like a double-edged sword in this case, where you want to have everyone as informed as possible, but you kind of run into the issue of not having, like, you know, panicking people, keeping them like news hungry is something that she talked about. Everyone wants to be updated with what's coming up, what's the next move, and it kind of just like puts a lot of pressure on the media outlets to just produce. And she was talking about she has the data of how many people are looking into like different news articles on the web and stuff, and she said that they have record numbers of viewers and hits on the website, but they're also in a budget crunch since people aren't like coming together for like, and they don't run ads on the actual like broadcast. So they're kind of she's in this unique position where she's not like a private enterprise, she's a public media company, and she wants to keep like people informed and not panic them. And she runs into this moral dilemma of keeping the public informed but not in a panic state. So Emily talked a lot about being very critical of the news sources that she consumed whenever she would come into new articles about COVID and how things were presented, and talking about the visuals that would accompany stories. So in the first slide, there was a picture of an Asian doctor administering a COVID test, and that was like the first image that came out around March or around February when coronavirus started coming to the United States, which kind of associates the virus with China and makes China like this enemy against us, which is pretty problematic. So she talked a lot about that. And she talks about there's also a lot of frustrations that come with places where there's maybe not a lot of cases, or there's no cases, but the whole county is shut down. So she has to mitigate a lot of different emotions when she's writing her stories. Like, how are they going to perceive this? Oh yeah, they're still shut down for another 2 months, even though we have no cases for the last 3 months. So a lot of people are frustrated. So she has to empathize a lot with her viewers. And that was one of the main points that we got across from a media practitioner, Emily Bright.
Okay, so another example of media was this article from the New York Times that we sent you guys earlier this week. And this was a attempt at fact-checking by Kevin Roos. And analyzing this article was really interesting because it shows a lot of what we've been talking about, like the original media that was coming out around this person who thought that she'd proved that COVID was man-made. She used a lot of titles like doctor, claimed she had solid scientific evidence, really was portrayed as someone who knew what she was talking about and someone who was speaking facts and uncontroversial proof. And that was really an example of using language to manipulate, but then going forth and delving deeper into it, we see that once they started fact-checking, once they started looking into the sources, the journal that she used was not peer-reviewed. All of the various scientists who came back to disagree with her had peer reviews, had credible sources, had actual facts, and it was an example of a narrative that was originally started and then eventually combated, but it was kind of too late because the original narrative was useful for a certain political game and was something that people wanted to hear, and it had already gotten out there. People already believed it. By the time that we started fact-checking it and fixing it, people were committed to the first one. They said, oh, but look, she's a doctor, she's using science, she's using facts. And it was just a very clear case of how social media can take these things and run with it, and different articles and things can go in so many different directions, that we thought it would be an interesting thing for you guys to read, just so you could kind of have a real world example of some of the stuff that we've been talking about.
So at last we have the discussion topics that close out our presentation. This is just basically to disseminate among yourselves, but it's just sort of a jumping off point in terms of what we want to talk about and what, a question we wanted to start. So number one, are media sources using credible professionals to intentionally misinform their audiences? This can be on both sides, whether it be more conservative news sources, Fox News with with Tucker Carlson, like we saw, Ben Shapiro, who has a podcast, or the more liberal media sources like CNN with Don Lemon, Chris Cuomo. Number two, what is the reasoning behind this, and what is their motivation? So is it to scare, to warn, to sort of push in a political direction? And what is to gain from these inaccuracies? Number three, is speed better than accuracy in terms of reporting, getting all the information first and then presenting, or is it in terms of holding off and making sure you have all your ducks in a row? And number four, the moral dilemma, panic versus prevention in terms of this pandemic.
So does anybody in either the classroom or listening through Zoom want to comment on any of these?
I'll make a few comments. I'm a physician, and I think as far as the first question, I think they obviously have secondary gains from their reporting. Everybody does, and that has to be taken into consideration. The history of what they've done may be important. The bottom two comments, speed is obviously important. You want to provide the information when it happens. Accuracy, however, should be just as important, but you should get it out as soon as you feel it has a certain level of accuracy. Moral dilemma, panic versus prevention, I think that's somewhat of an inappropriate way of looking at it. You want the information, the truth, as much good information as you can provide from people who have some experience with it. And just to give you my, that related to the Kierkegaard statement, when I listen to all this as it comes through, I have a lot of information and knowledge and experience that relate to a lot of this. So I feel I process the information very quickly as far as what's important and what's not. For example, this Chinese thing, they released the genome for the virus within, I think, 24 hours of this being recognized it was a big problem. And they released it to the world. That, to me, was such a dramatic finding and fact that it was very important in my whole thinking on this thing. I think when they were doing that, they knew they were scared and they had a real problem, and that this was the most important thing, to let all the other scientists try to deal with this and do whatever they can to develop tests, to develop drugs. And it makes me think that the Chinese, something happened that this came out, probably natural, but it could have been a leak from a lab, unintentional. I think it's unlikely it's intentional, because I don't see much advantage for anybody to intentionally do this unless they're unbalanced or crazy or just a deranged person that I think they'd be just as interested in dealing with as anyone else. And then the other thing is there is a whole standard of how to deal with these type of contagious diseases dating back to the plague. And there's been a whole learning process of this whole thing about, washing your hands for hundreds of years, finding out where the problem is, and applying these things in an effective way. But I also know from other epidemics that one of the critical things is acting immediately, getting the information as quickly as possible, being as truthful as possible, and implementing those things as quickly as possible, and using your resources to the maximum benefit. And all of that, as far as this country goes, I think broke down from the first facts of the whole problem. And I think part of the problem is you have not that bottom moral dilemma. The moral dilemma is to find out as best you can what's real, what's true, and what's important, and distribute that information as effectively as possible, which takes a lot of work. Dealing with people, I deal with patients all the time, and you have to convince them that what we know and can do, what the limits are and what the benefits are. And things like dealing with an epidemic is tremendously important because we can do a lot. There are a lot of things we know are very effective. You can prevent a lot of lives lost. Doctors work all the time in indecision, not knowing what to do, not having the information, not sure whether their treatment's going to work, using placebos basically by giving them something they think isn't going to hurt them, and maybe it'll help them because they'll think it helps them. The problems with the epidemic is we know a lot. We can treat it. We can prevent it. We can deal with it. And the whole thing fell apart right from the beginning. And it was a total failure. And every time I read the news and hear new things, I feel, how could this have happened? We knew how to prevent it. Other countries did it. And it just drives me crazy to think we screwed this up so much. One of the things I get most upset about is the lack of effectiveness of the FDA, the CDC, that have been extremely, extremely effective in providing the help to deal with these things. The CDC for epidemics, the FDA for developing therapies for it. I've worked with those institutions. I've been extremely impressed with how effective they were in the things, specific things I've dealt with, a specific epidemic in a dialysis unit I dealt with. And I called the CDC and I was able to get their help, even though they weren't supposed to give me their help because they're supposed to be called in by the public health authorities beforehand. I couldn't get the people I was working with because of their secondary gains to not deal with this epidemic. Nobody wants to know about it. They want to bury it, just like people are doing with this one. But eventually, I got the CDC people to talk to the people locally, talk to the people who ran the dialysis unit that had a lot of secondary gain from not doing anything. And the one telephone call, they basically told these people, they were very powerful people that I couldn't deal with because I didn't have enough power. They told these people what they knew how to deal with it. They knew what the information they were getting from these other people was totally incorrect. They confronted them immediately and told them, you're wrong, and this is what you have to do. And the one telephone call basically shut them up and told them what they had to do. And the whole problem was resolved in the next few months because we did exactly what the CDC wanted to do and knew how to do. They dealt with these epidemics before. They knew about it. They knew the whole story. And that never happened in the last year. The CDC has been destroyed by its leadership and by not using it the way it needs to be used. And the same thing with the FDA. They're worthless now. And this whole thing is so upsetting when we knew so much and applied it so poorly.
So I want to just make one comment about what you know and how different things are now from when I was younger. So when my brother was in 11th grade, he got in trouble for a history report where the teacher called him and said, I want to talk to you about your report on the Monroe Doctrine. You don't understand the difference between a primary, secondary, and tertiary source. And my brother goes, what do you mean? Well, primary source material, that would mean you would be looking at Monroe's notes. And my brother goes, yes. My older brother is a freshman at Yale. He works in microfilm, and they have the complete collection. And when I visited him, he showed me and she goes, oh, never mind. When I was young, it was very hard to get primary sources. It was a lot of work. And this is one of the big differences right now. And I think one of the things that the media group was highlighting, which I think is extremely important, is the different hats people wear. Is someone an entertainer? Is someone a reporter? What is the purpose of the story? There's a really nice clip, which I think Paul might be able to put in the chat, from the former president, I believe, of CBS, about the election of Trump in 2016 is going to be good money for us with all the stories this is going to be generating. That a lot of, one of the questions is, why are things being done? Follow the money is often a really good guiding principle in terms of trying to decide what's going on. We are now living and have lived, I think, for years in a 24/7 news cycle. There's always something going on. And is there now a push for people to have certain markets and present information that way? And I think one of my goals and the goals of the people who push for a class like this is to try to create tendencies not to just listen to random sources or to sources that might echo the beliefs you already have, but actually to search out what are the facts. And so in the CNN story, it talks about, this is 5 times worse than, this is like equivalent, I think, to the last 5 years of flu. And it's the worst one since 1968 when there was about 100,000. Well, there was a flu epidemic in 1968. And it would be fascinating, and I hope the group that's doing pandemics looks at the 1968 flu as to how did that affect society, how did we choose to deal with things then. Also, of course, one of the challenges is how do you count things? And so when you just say these numbers of how many deaths there are, can you accept the number just because this is the number that's been told? The last point I want to put on is the moral dilemma, the panic versus prevention. This is a great topic to think about. If you're in a leadership position, let's say you are afraid that the economy is shaking, you're afraid that there's a run on the banks that is about to happen. Do you issue certain statements to try to reassure the people, and hopefully these become self-fulfilling prophecies? Or do you publicly say, yeah, if I were you, I would get your money out of the bank right now? And so there's some interesting quandaries as to what do you do in a leadership position. Is speed better than accuracy? This is again, a wonderful point. Now that we have news 24/7, it's no longer you have an entire day. As Emily wrote that she gets the information at 11, she's on the air at 12, she has 1 hour. And what are you able to do in that time? Does anybody else have other things that they would like to add to the discussion? So could you show the slide again about the CNN and Fox hours spent?
Yes, hold on. Let me try to go back.
You had it a moment ago. It was the pie. It was the chart with the blue.
Yeah, there we go.
So both of these are their 24-hour news network stations, correct?
Yes.
I believe so.
So is this time throughout the entire day? Is it time during prime time? So is this the total coverage of anything related to COVID for that period?
Yes. Yes, it's for the days that are listed underneath. It's the coverage that CNN and Fox News spent per day talking about COVID-19 related aspects.
Because one of the things that I'm interested in is it then noticeable that either, let's say Fox, which is not spending as much time, are they spending more time on other stories? And if so, what stories are they spending the time on? How many minutes of airtime do we have in these weeks? So is this, what is it, on the order of 4 days?
Oh, it's actually, I'm looking back at the original study. I believe that it's during their morning news program.
Okay, because I was going to say the number of minutes here, if you consider a 4-day period, just makes no sense. Also, a lot of times the stories on certain networks, they keep repeating every hour or something like that sometimes. So this is on morning shows.
Yeah, and when you look at headlines, it ends up being a little less drastic, which is interesting to contrast. Fox had 331 headlines on the pandemic, while CNN had 372 headlines during the same 6-week period that this covers.
And by headlines, do you mean stuff on the bottom of the screen, or?
No, like print, like
Okay.
online.
But yeah, to me, it would be interesting to know how many minutes are available in each of those blocks for news. What percent of the time is CNN and Fox spending on those stories? And then is there something else that's getting a significant amount of time on Fox that's not on CNN? Where is the coverage going? And again, always comes down to whenever you see a chart, always ask, what are the labels? And here on this chart, I think it's a little hard to initially see what's going on. I always like to know what percent of the morning show is it like an hour show? Yes.
It's also a little strange that on the chart seeing blue, but their logo is typically red and Fox News is red on the chart, their logo is typically blue.
Yes.
So at first glance, it's like the opposite of what you expect.
So why do you think they have the colors that way?
I assume they did it based on traditional political channel, but
Right. Although the color code only goes back on the order of 20 years. It used to flip-flop, I believe. It might have been by incumbent. So we have time for one last question or comment. And then I guess the last thing to just leave everybody with is just how important word choiceage is. In some math papers I've written, they have occasionally objected to adjectives that we have used to describe some results or whatnot. And we have been too excited and too happy about something, and those emotions must be purged. And it is fascinating, what words do you choose and how can that impact as you're reading? So just things to think about. All right, have a good day all. On Friday, we will talk about the homework problems. Have a great day.